Hello and welcome to another Consent Dojo. I am Midori, your host, and well, I am the curious and ignorant. I am the one that gets to bring on my brilliant friends and colleagues who have very interesting perspectives, specific perspectives on consent and talk about it. So what's Consent Dojo about? It is about building our consent muscle. Consent is not easy. I want to say it's simple, but it's not. It's neither simple nor is it easy. And the more we consider it, the more nuance there is. So diving in to a lot of different perspectives. I started this out a couple of years ago now and focusing mostly around kink and bondage. But in the 2 years hence, we've expanded our interest in talking about art, politics, policy, sexuality, and now, today, we are going to be talking about BDSM, Judaism, and sex therapy. BDSM, Judaism, sex therapy, the Venn diagram. This is going to be interesting. And I am absolutely fascinated. I'm not Jewish. I am a devout, I mean that pun or joke. I am a devout atheist with a deep fascination to religiosity. My particular background is Zen influence from Japan, and I am so looking forward to learning today from, let's see, I'm going to bring her onto the screen now. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest, Stefani. And I'm going to butcher your last name for as long as I've known you. I want to say Goerlich.
Goerlich.
You
give it the German umlaut that we have when we go to Europe, but in America, they just say Goerlich.
So it's not, oh, okay. Okay, great. I'm going to keep butchering that. So I hope I have to get better on that. So would you kindly tell us about what kind of magical being you are?
Unicorn on the best days, if we're picking magical beings. No, I am a certified sex therapist and a board certified clinical sexologist I'm based in Metro Detroit. I'm licensed in a handful of states. And my clinical practice is very small and very intentional, because with the remaining part of my time, I write about BDSM, kink, and mental health. I speak at conferences, schools, you name it, all over the world. I do media and expert witness consultation work. And because I had a scrap of free time left, decided to help co-organize a podcast and conference with my partner and a group of our friends. They had organized conferences in the past. I had not. So speaking of informed consent, I don't know that I fully had it, but I'm engaged now. So that is my day. I spend all day, every day thinking about, talking about, writing and reading about BDSM and kink.
So let's launch in. Oh, but I got to tell my corny joke, the one that I came up with.
Go for it. Yeah.
So a Leatherman, a rabbi, and a sex therapist walk into a bar. Tell me how many drinks are ordered. One drink, because it's the same person. I think I came up with that when we were talking before this.
I loved it.
I'm going to turn the stage over to you and let you start talking. I would like to, for the sake of, I would like for you to cover some Judaism basics for the rest of us out here.
That is an incredibly broad topic. We're talking 6,000 years of oral and written tradition, but I will try to do it in maybe 5 minutes or less. So Judaism is one of the three Abrahamic traditions. It was the OG Abrahamic tradition. Out of Judaism came Christianity. Out of those two, a couple centuries later, came Islam. We're all cousins. We have our similarities and our differences. In America, because it is a sort of Christian prominent culture, people tend to look at Judaism as Christianity minus Jesus. They tend to have this sort of, if I understand Christianity and Christian culture, I probably understand Judaism, and that's where things go maybe a little bit askew. So within Judaism, there's our own corny joke, one Jew, three opinions. And that's certainly true with literally anything that I say tonight. Anything I say tonight, I probably have another opinion on myself. And certainly anybody joining us tonight will also have the things that they agree with and the things that they have heard slightly differently. And that's one of the beauties of this tradition. Jews our nickname for ourselves is the ones who wrestle with God. We're not about having answers, we're about exploring the questions. And we study in pairs specifically so we can do that. So I love conversations like this because the ideal form of Jewish learning is not sitting alone by yourself with a book. It is sitting together with someone else over that book and picking it apart and talking about what you agree with and arguing about what you disagree with and arguing with each other about the things that fall into the Venn between those two. It is a tradition of conversation. Within that conversation, there are different distinct movements, kind of from most sort of progressive or even secular to most conservative. So a lot of Jews today identify as sort of secular or cultural Jews. They were raised with holidays, traditions, they maybe went to Hebrew school. They might not have gone to Shabbat services, but they consider themselves rooted in their Jewish identity. Jewish, as Lady Viper says, yes. From there, you move into your more secular, but now a bit observant traditions like the humanistic Jewish movement, which is a lovely place for people like yourself, Midori, who are perhaps atheist, but still want a community and want to embrace and explore and recontextualize those traditions. So the humanist Jews are towards probably the furthest left on our spectrum. From there, we have the Reconstructionists, who look at Judaism as a cultural tradition to be reclaimed and protected and maintained. So they don't necessarily put a lot of heavy emphasis into spirituality or the supernatural, but they do the cultural celebrations, the holidays, teaching the children tradition, and they put a lot of focus on the sort of tribal ethnic ties of Judaism. From there, we get to my house, which is the Reform movement. The Reform movement actually is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, distinct movement within Judaism. Because up until about the last 150 years, there was no such thing. You were just a Jew. And you might have a different rabbi, and your rabbi might have slightly different teachings than the rabbi in the village on the other side of town, other side of the mountain. But everybody was just Jew. So the concept of movements, the concept of Jewish denominations is pretty new. And part of that is because the Reform movement kind of led the way with that. They, in Europe in the 1900s, were like, look, we want to put the shtetl behind us. We want to modernize. We want to be more egalitarian. Frankly, we want to be less oppressed and a little bit more like the people that are currently oppressing us so that they will leave us alone. So the Reform movement in the 1900s went really far extreme. They threw Hebrew out. They threw a lot of the traditions and trappings, the things that we associate with Judaism, like wearing a kippah, a prayer shawl, all of those were thrown by the wayside because the Reform movement was the modern movement, which lasted until about the 50s. World War II changed a lot of that. All of a sudden, the Reform movement was like, okay, wait, just because we don't want to do it doesn't mean anybody else can put it down. And so there started to be kind of a recalibration. And now the Reform movement is more spiritual than some of the more left-leaning branches. Most of them will have some connection to some concept of deity. They will pick and choose which of the laws and traditions they observe. the idea is that in the reform movement, the ultimate authority for decision-making is the individual. So you'll consult with your rabbi. You will learn and educate yourself. You will know why you're making the choices that you're making. But at the end of the day, you get to decide what choices you make. The conservative movement says, okay, you get to decide what choices you make, but your rabbi needs to be your primary consultant. You need to be making these decisions informed by your specific spiritual leader. And you need to defer to his wisdom, because no matter how much you've read, your rabbi has probably read more than you have. So they are a bit more observant, a bit more traditional in terms of keeping kosher, prayer shawls and kippas, but they also ordain female clergy. They also affirm LGBT relationships, like all of their more left-leaning friends and cousins. And it's a nice, like, sort of middle spot between the liberal observance of reform movement and the more strictured orthodox approach of orthodoxy. When you get into the Orthodox community, that's where I'm going to stop, because we can break them down into 100 different groups. But essentially, the Orthodox are the most stringent in their observance. They take practice very seriously. At its core, Judaism is an orthopractic religion, meaning we emphasize right behavior more than right belief. Can argue and pick and pull apart all sorts of different ideas, but at the end of the day, you need to behave a certain way. And the Orthodox communities become increasingly more strict around what that behavior looks like. So that is the roughly 5-minute overview of the Jewish modern world. How overwhelmed are you right now?
Excellent, roughly 5 minutes. So, and I want to actually also address something, because somebody just pointed out to me that me telling you that I'll probably continue to butcher your name is a form of microaggression. I apologize on
You're
that.
fine.
Okay.
You gave it a German pronunciation. That's exactly how people pronounce it when we travel in Europe. And the way I said it is the way people say it when we're here. Both are technically correct.
And I would like you to help me out, because I don't see you enough to be practicing your name.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah, and hadn't thought about that. And I think what I meant to say was, when I do butcher it, please help me.
I can do that.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, there was a comment on the side of, would Renewal fall into humanist?
So they are distinct movements with their own organizational bodies, their own rabbinical ordination processes. So they would say no. There can be some blurring between the two. I would say that the easiest sort of rule of thumb to differentiate is that Renewal can be more mystical, a little bit more esoteric. Renewal might be closer to hippie Jews, whereas humanistic Jews tend to be very logical, very rational. We're not going to engage thoughts of the supernatural. That's not our focus. We are here to repair the world and build a community. So they are distinct, but I can see overlap between the two for sure.
Okay, and I will invite people to continue to put in comments, questions, etc. So now that we had the brief version of Judaism Basic in 5 minutes or less, thank you. Why are we talking about the intersection of BDSM, Judaism, and sex therapy? Why does it matter? And by the way, for the viewers who are joining me for the first time, I ask questions that may, for some of you, feel obvious, but I'm also trying to ask the questions that other people might be thinking. So, what do you think?
I think the reason why it matters is because cultural competency should be a part of any therapist's practice. And frankly, cultural competency should be a part of just being a good, neighbor and global citizen. We live in an age where everybody is connected to everybody else. And if there's somebody or some community you don't know about, we have the entirety of the internet in our pocket at all times. So the idea that we don't necessarily need to know about things because they don't directly impact us or because we don't know somebody who's a part of that community doesn't hold water anymore. And as a sex therapist, as a therapist at all, my job is always to make sure that my colleagues are prepared to meet their clients where they are. And a part of that is understanding them as holistic people. When we talk about sex therapy, when we're working with a client, we don't just talk about genitals and sex positions. We talk about every aspect of their lives because every aspect of their lives directly play into their thoughts and feelings and responses and fears about sex and intimacy. So you can't parse things out into neat little bundles. And I think that because we do live in a country that does have such a strong denominational presence within Christianity, that a lot of people tend to assume that the way America thinks about sex and relationships and intimacy is the way all people do, when really it's been heavily informed by a culture that not every American is a part of.
In terms of this intersection of the three circles, how much has it been addressed up to now?
BDSM and Judaism specifically, I would say very little. There have been some resources, the Leather Seder, which you and I were talking about before we started, some community things that have been created over the years. There are some writings on Jewish sexuality and Jewish approaches to sexuality that will occasionally touch on it. But most of what we have is actually really community driven. It's people coming together in Facebook groups or FetLife groups or frankly dating websites and finding each other by having conversations about, you know, I'm single and I'm looking for a partner and I want a partner whose fetishes align with mine. And also I want a partner who wants to go to Shabbat every week. And there's not a dating website for that. So a lot of it is community, because we are fortunate enough to have social media, community finding each other and building space for one another. And so you can find phenomenal resources and prayers and rituals and jokes online. But in terms of academic or more professional work specifically on these communities, I don't know that there's much out there.
Oh, speaking of things that aren't much out there, can you, I know it's a little aside, but your books.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see the book on my bookshelf and I'm not at my office right now. I see the beautiful brown leather couch. And could you talk a little about your writing?
Sure. So my first book is exactly that. It's The Leather Couch, Clinical Practice with Kinky Clients. I wrote that actually while I was doing my training as a sex therapist, because one of the first things, really technically should be the very first thing that anybody who wants to become a sex therapist does is a 14 to more hours workshop called a SAR, a Sexual Attitudes Reassessment. And it is a time for people to come together because they want to train in this field and they are exposed to lots of different, sometimes difficult content about different sexualities, different genders, different relationships. And it is a time to actively challenge yourself to think about what resonates with you, to figure out what maybe activates you, and to work through that before you're ever sitting with a client. That is the foundational point of entry into sex therapy. And when I did my SAR, the group I was with was very close and it was very small. And we were shown videos of some individuals with pretty severe physical limitations who were working with sex workers to maintain intimacy and connection in spite of what people might consider to be difficulties. And the people I was with were, oh, that's so beautiful, that's so brave. And we saw videos of very elderly couples who couldn't have penetrative sex anymore, but were still holding and touching and caressing. And people were drying their eyes and saying, I hope my partner and I are like that when we are old. And it was very lovely and very affirming. And then we got to the 90-ish minutes that we got on BDSM and Kink. and the energy in the room changed. And it got very giggly and it got very whispery. And at one point, somebody was literally cracking jokes about what was on the screen. And then they went, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I couldn't help it." And I looked at them and I said, "Well, you absolutely could, because you knew enough to immediately apologize. You just didn't think you needed to." And I walked away really upset, because this was a group of people who were already fully licensed mental and medical health providers. These are not people in training. These are people who have self-selected into sexual health. So you're assuming they're coming to it with a certain degree of enthusiasm, engagement, affirmation. And I saw that consistently for every population group except for the Kinksters. And I literally left my SAR, and as I was doing my sex therapy training, I was riding the leather couch. So it came out a year after I got my sex therapy certification, I think, if I'm remembering the timing right. And it's unique in that all three of the major sexual health organizations in America, STAR, which is the Society for Sex Therapy and Research, very rigorous, very academic, very small and focused on science. ASECT, which is the group that credentials most every sex therapist, educator, and counselor in the country. And then SASH, which, any Broadway fans, ASECT and SASH are kind of like the Sharks and the Jets philosophically. SASH is the sex addiction model therapist, and ASECT is the sex is not addictive model therapist. All three of them gave the leather couch their book awards for their respective years. So it's really unusual for such disparate communities to go, yeah, that was pretty okay. And so that was the first one. The advanced practice sequel, which is called Kink-Affirming Practice, Culturally Competent Therapy from the Leather Chair, just came out last August. I realize these are lengthy titles. My publisher really likes titles that tell you exactly what's in the box. But that takes sort of the foundational introduction to BDSM and mental health that Leather Couch did in a deeper direction. We get more into kink history and the history of the leather community and why kinksters should be approached from a cultural competency perspective as a distinct cultural group with traditions and norms and vocabulary and language and everything that goes with it. We look at different forms of power exchange and fetish play and how those might be compared to therapeutic modalities like age play and pet play, and how does that connect to play therapy for adults, things like that. So Leather Couch is the foundational. If you don't know anything about your kinky clients, start here. Kink-affirming practices. Okay, hopefully you've developed a love for your kinky clients now and you want to take it deeper. And then I'm super excited because in October, my first book for couples comes out, and it is called With Sprinkles on Top: Everything Vanilla People and Their Kinky Partners Need to Communicate, Explore, and Connect. And it is focused specifically on a group that makes up a significant portion of my clinical practice, which is people in mixed desire relationships, where one partner is kinky and one partner is vanilla, and that is causing difficulty in their relationship. So those are the three that are out so far. I am under contract for 2 more, and I feel like I've talked a lot right now, so I'm going to take a breath and see if you have any questions about those.
You are prolific. So I wanted to talk about your books a bit, but talk to that Venn diagram with 3 circles. You talked a bit about what clinicians may have a bit of blind spot about. Now, in terms of clients as well as ordinary folks who are kinky and Jewish, and what are you noticing people are encountering, positive as well as challenging?
So I think there's 2 distinct sort of sets of needs. There are the challenges that people experience within their own communities. Again, the more stringent your level of community observance, the less wiggle room your friends and neighbors and family give you to deviate from that. So there are people who are living deeply religious lives and also having consensual, validating, affirming, pleasurable, kinky experiences with their spouse or with somebody else. And they deal with a lot of guilt and shame around that because the laws of purity are not the same as Christian purity culture, but they are very much present. And so the further you go into observance, the more stringent the expectation of sexual and relational purity becomes. And things like shaking a woman's hand might not be acceptable in your everyday community, but then you go on a business trip, you visit a public dungeon, you visit a dominant that you're friends with in that city, and you have an experience that might not involve removing clothing at all, might not involve anything that we would consider to be sexual, but violates the purity standards for the home community. So that sort of guilt and shame and that wrestling with, is what I'm doing okay? Is what I'm doing appropriate? Is a big challenge with my Orthodox clients. And then for my more liberal and progressive Jewish clients, a lot of it is frustration with their therapists who think that Christian understandings of sex and marriage apply to them. The idea that sex before marriage is a sin, or the idea that polyamory is forbidden, or the idea that kink is seen as dirty and shameful, or even that sin is a concept for these clients. A lot of very well-intentioned therapists lack Jewish cultural competency. And so in trying to help their clients with whatever issues are bringing them to therapy, they kind of apply this cultural lens that isn't relevant. So it's this combo pack of, am I violating community norms in a way that would lead to social repercussions for me? And is there somewhere I can go to talk about this where they're actually going to understand me when I talk about it?
And when clients are encountering not enough knowledge or understanding in terms of the professional's part?
I mean, we talk about microaggressions a little bit already. That can be a huge part of it. This assumptiveness about one's culture, this assumptiveness about one's beliefs, the idea that I don't need to ask you how you're feeling about that because I already think I know, is a microaggression. And having a basic knowledge of things like, what is Shabbat? Why would that matter to somebody when you're scheduling sessions? Why would that matter to somebody in terms of what they're doing with their spouse? What do the different holidays have to do with one's sex life and intimacy? What might I expect my client to wear to a session, and what might I not be surprised to see them wearing under what they wear to a session? There's a lot of just sort of community college world religions 101 that I think most clinicians lack across the board, not just for Jews, but for most other community groups and religious groups. And all of those things, those out of the bedroom things, absolutely impact their clients' lives and relationships in ways that tie directly into their intimacy.
And then there's the kink aspect of it, because with my work, working with the Sexual Health Alliance and kink-informed certification, because I help out with the curriculum around that for the helping professionals. Yes, I mean, the world is changing, but there's still professionals and clinicians who automatically make assumptions around BDSM.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough enough to find a kink-informed therapist, a kink-informed sex therapist, and the kink-aware professionals list is helpful for that. But how does one find kink competent, kink affirming, and Judaism competent and theologically affirming sex therapist or any therapist?
I mean, I ideally would love to see a directory that is sortable by those factors. We have Psychology Today, we have things like that. And honestly, Psychology Today now has become not a terrible place to start because you can search by do they understand Judaism versus do they understand Buddhism? You can search for, are they poly-affirming? Are they kink aware? And so the really large websites have gotten to a point where you can dial down enough to give yourself a list to start with. But then that leads into other variables and other barriers, like, do they have a wait list? Do they take insurance? If they don't, can I afford them? We are a very small community, and even where we're easy to find, which isn't everywhere, sometimes it becomes necessary. And I hate to say this as a therapist, but as somebody that believes in self-advocacy, I think it's sometimes important to be willing to educate your therapist. As a therapist, I don't think you should ever ask your clients to educate you. So it's a fine tightrope to walk, because I want to empower people to say, I like your philosophy, I like your approach, I get how you work with my depression or our relationship. I realize that you might be Jewish, but you don't know a lot about kink. I'm happy to give you resources if you want them. Or I realize that you're kink informed, but I'm the first Jew you've ever met. I'm happy to give you resources if you want to. It's frustrating because I don't feel like clients should have to do that, but I also encourage people to be willing to, because sometimes the way you find your best fit clinician is to kind of co-create that best fit with them.
So that's with existing therapeutic relationship. What about when shopping for a therapist?
Well, when shopping, it's important to have open and direct conversations. The research shows that about 30 to 40% of kinky people have experienced stigma from their health providers, whether it's a medical doctor or a therapist. And I have at least one study in my research journal articles that said that something like 23% of therapists admitted to having told a client that was kinky that they wouldn't work with them if they continued to engage in BDSM. They would give them an ultimatum of, if you want to work with me, you need to stop that. So I think a huge thing you can do is to be really transparent from the get-go. When you make that initial inquiry, when you're asking about copays and insurance coverage, say, I am in a power exchange relationship and I want a therapist that understands what that means and is comfortable with it. Or I'm poly and I want a therapist that's not going to pathologize that. And really start making that one of your sort of basic pro forma questions. At the same time that we talk about availability and wait lists, we need to be talking about those deal breaker competencies that we're looking for.
And shopping for a therapist, I'm assuming that sometimes people get to shop when they have the bandwidth to ask questions with clarity, and sometimes people are looking for a therapist when they are in crisis and just having a hard time just even forming basic questions, or maybe coming from, I come from Japan, not a therapy culture at all. So there could even be shame or discomfort around that. And then you add to it sex therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God.
The nice thing is that, at the risk of my own friends and colleagues yelling at me later, is that not everybody necessarily needs a sex therapist.
Mm-hmm.
If what you are looking for is a kink-affirming therapist to help you work through your divorce or your anxiety or your bipolar disorder or your schizophrenia, the issue that you're seeking support with isn't necessarily the fact that you're kinky. It's not something, it informs their work with you because it informs their understanding of you, but you can find somebody that can do great work around your specific issue and bring in the kink pieces as necessary, as opposed to the majority of my clients who are coming to me specifically because of issues related to sexuality, intimacy, and gender. So I think it's always really important to kind of parse out whether or not somebody thinks they need a sex therapist because they are a gender minority or a non-conventional relationship, or they're an erotic minority, and therefore they feel they'll be better understood by a sex therapist, or whether the primary reason they're seeking therapy is directly connected to their sexual and relational health. And I think that if the answer to that second one is no, then you can probably make your search field a little wider by looking for a general mental health clinician who has the cultural competencies that you're looking for.
Okay, so on that point, what's a couple, 3, 4 questions one can ask, if I can ask myself, or anyone can ask themselves, of do I need a general, or do I need a sex therapist, or other kinds of therapist? What's like some questions I can ask of myself?
Okay. Number one, is the issue that is motivating me to come to therapy related to my physical body, my physical form, and how it works? So that could be, somebody that's questioning their gender and looking perhaps for transition support. That can be somebody that's dealing with low libido and is frustrated and wanting to know why they don't want sex anymore. That can be somebody who is having painful sex with their partner. They genuinely want to have intimate connections, but when they do, it's physically painful. So is the number one reason you're looking for therapy related to your physical body in some way? Number two would be, is it related to your relationship in some way? And that could be mismatched desire. That can be difficulty around orientation. I've had several couples where one partner is questioning whether or not they're gay or straight, and their spouse is like, well, I thought that was settled when we got married. That's a question that comes in quite a bit. So if it's about your intimate relationship with your partner, if that's the primary reason you're seeking therapy, sex therapy might be a good fit. And then the other one is if there's something about your sexual behaviors or sexuality that you're finding bothersome, troublesome, that you feel guilt and shame about, even if nobody else knows about it, and you want to work through those feelings and better understand what you do, why you do it, and how to feel about it, that can also be a good time to seek out sex therapy. If you're dealing with things like going through a breakup and it's really hard dealing with the transition from being in a long-term relationship to being single, or I lost my job, or my kids and I aren't communicating well, or I was just diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Anything that would be true regardless of what's happening in your body, your relationship, you can probably look for a kink aware or Jewishly, culturally aware mainstream mental health clinician.
Thank you. And related to that, somebody asks, can you offer some initial screening questions that somebody could use when they're first talking with a therapist to determine whether they're a good fit? And because of the topic of today, I'm going to asterisk Judaism and BDSM.
That can be difficult because everybody's priorities are going to be different, and what you're looking for is going to be different compared to what Midori might be looking for, compared to what I might be looking for. So I think the first step in that is being really clear about sort of what your deal breakers are and what your must-haves are. And then ask questions about both of those. If you want somebody that understands what it means to be an observant Jew, ask that question. Have you had Jewish clients before? How observant were they? Do you understand Jewish law? Do you understand how that impacts the scenarios and the daily challenges I'm going to bring up in session? If it's related to sexuality and gender, you can ask, are you an affirming clinician? Do you offer gender affirming care? Do you refer for gender affirming care? The referral piece can be an important question, especially in this age where we're living in an age where a lot of sex therapists and a lot of sexuality professionals are being slandered for our work. And the rise of the kind of calling everybody grooming and calling everybody a groomer has become very fearful for a lot of us. And so there are people who are affirming of trans people, but who don't feel safe doing that work. So then the question is, will you refer me to somebody who will? If the answer is no, if the answer is I don't do that work and I will not refer you to somebody else, that should be a glaring red flag. And that should be true across the board. Are you comfortable working with a lesbian couple? No? Okay, will you refer me to somebody who is? Also no? Good to know. So asking who they're like, asking what resources they're comfortable providing can be a big tell. But truly ask how many clients they've had that were similar to you before. And what similar to you means is going to vary depending upon who you are. You might want to know how many Jewish clients have they had before. Everybody always asks me, how many kinky people have you had before? Now it's starting to get, how many people have you had that have my specific fetish? Have you had this specific thing before? And sometimes the answer is no. But what I do in those moments is I say, I might not have had somebody that uses the exact words that you're using to describe what they desire. But when I hear you talk about what you desire, this is what that connects to for me. I think of, oh, that's like rope play, or that's power exchange. And I have had people that enjoy rope play or who are in power exchange relationships. So look for people who have had clients similar to you, whichever criteria of yours you want to use. And if they say, nope, never met anybody like you before, that's probably another red flag, because they should be able to know enough to make that same sort of cognitive connections that I do, where you can say, you know, honestly, I haven't, but I'm familiar enough with what you're saying to be able to connect it to somebody else. They might not give a definitive answer because it can be hard. I mean, I've had hundreds of clients over the year. I don't know, or over the years, I don't know that I've had exactly 14 foot fetishists in my career. But they should be able to say, you know, I've had more than 3, or they should be able to say, I've never encountered that before, but I'm willing to learn.
And I think that addresses a question an individual asked, what should I do if they won't give a number? I think that just answered it. Okay, I'm going to go into a little first person here. I remember, and the cultural thing came up in dealing with a therapist I had a while back in a way that I didn't anticipate. And yeah, like I said, born and raised in Japan, but I don't necessarily sound like it. And I have worked darned hard to, well, Americanize myself, and this country fits me and it suits me. And yet, because up until 14, 15, I was over there, right? Okay, fast forward many, many, many years and many relationships later, and I'm with a therapist dealing about commonplace intimacy communication stuff. And the therapist, older lesbian, white, I believe American raised. And she had given me a touch, eye-gazing touch, cuddle exercise. And I did it, and and tried it, and I was so uncomfortable. So incredibly uncomfortable. And then I thought about it, I'm like, oh, I'm still Japanese. Oh, wow. And so I went back, and in another session, I mentioned that this didn't work out. You know what it's like if you hold a cat for too long and the cat doesn't want to be held?
Yeah.
Right? Like the cat wants to sit next to you, not be held by you. It was kind of like that. And so I explained that, look, I'm from Japan and we have very different ways of touch. And I don't think this was working because it doesn't work with my culture. And I felt she didn't take me seriously. And that was upsetting. So I'm giving my example of it, but would that also, I'm assuming that might also help happen with Judaism, kink, and therapy.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say that one of my favorite people in the world, we always joke that he has the 8-pack Crayola emotional vocabulary, and we're building up to the 16-pack, and we're aiming for 64. And when we first met, he was trying to describe how he was feeling about something. And he goes, it's like sticky cat tape paws kind of feeling. And that is not an emotion. And yet it made perfect sense. So I totally resonate with your the cat being held too long sort of feeling. It's a great way to describe a sensory response. Yeah.
Mhm.
So um, a lot of people assume that because observant Jews put a lot of emphasis on purity and on separation, that they are prudish or that they are touch averse or that they are sex negative. And so some of my favorite things when I'm having conversations with clinicians is I tell them, you realize that sex on Shabbat is a mitzvah, right? Like it is a holy obligation to have sex on Shabbat, and it doesn't count until you've made the female partner orgasm. Female orgasm on Shabbat is a sacred obligation in the Jewish tradition. And they go, but they wear like skirts to their ankles and they won't even hold hands. What? And it blows their mind. And I talked to them about how in the Middle Ages, Jewish religious contracts or wedding contracts, rather, the ketubah, at the time, most wedding contracts were, this is how many donkeys and parcels of land I am paying you for your daughter. But the Jewish tradition, the wedding contract was actually the reverse. It protected the rights of the wife. It laid out her husband's obligations to take care of her, how often he needed to buy her new clothes, what his responsibility was for equipping the household, making sure she and the kids had food. It was literally a wife's bill of rights. And in the Middle Ages, so 12 to 1400s, Jewish wedding contracts laid out how often the wife deserved sexual satisfaction. And it was based on the husband's job. So if your husband was a sailor, he was legally obligated to have sexual intercourse with you to orgasm, yours, once every 6 months, because the expectation was he wasn't home much. But there was a whole like scale of, well, how close do they work to home and how hard is the labor? So a camel driver versus a farmer versus somebody that owns a shop. And if you have a white collar job, you should be making sure your wife has an orgasm every week minimum. And if you don't, she has the right to divorce you. And what's interesting is that the reverse is not true. Husband cannot divorce his wife for failing to have sex with him, but she can divorce him if he fails to do his marital duty. And so just things like that, when you share those factoids, completely change how somebody looks at the conservative or orthodox couple sitting on their clinical couch, because they're no longer thinking about it in terms of, well, are they embarrassed about sex? Are they allowed to have sex? My favorite is, I had somebody ask me once if religious Jews have sex through a hole in the sheet, because clearly they're very, very modest. And so you're not allowed to see each other naked at all, even when you're having sex. And I'm like, no, once you get married, pretty much all bets are off. So it's interesting to learn about the sex positive culture that these clients are living in. And admittedly, there are variants in each community. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The more extreme in observance you go, the less inclined they are towards celebrating pleasure in a lot of different ways. But for the vast majority of mainstream Jews, they come to therapy and have this sort of evangelical layer of purity culture put upon their relationship that isn't a part of their experience. And so unpacking that with clinicians can be really fun for them, because all of a sudden they don't feel like they're walking through a minefield and what they're allowed to say and what they're allowed to talk about. All of a sudden there are new possibilities and new questions and new avenues to explore. But they need to know that first. And it's really fascinating how heavily influenced we are by this idea that sex occurs only in marriage, only between heterosexual partners, only missionary position at night with the lights off for procreation only. And that is what healthy sex looks like if you're religious. And that's not at all the case for Jews.
And speaking of not knowing something, I do not know what the question in the chat refers to. So can you take a look and
I will peek. I think it's
laugh?
because women hung zizzi. So those are, there are 2 types of prayer shawls. And there's the big sort of blanket style that most people are familiar with, if they're familiar with them at all, that men wear when they're praying. There's also a smaller sort of undershirt version that has the fringes just in the four corners so that they wear under their clothes every day. And so what the commenter is saying is that back in the day, the women would be doing the laundry, they'd hang those on the line, and people not knowing what they were at all assumed that they were sheets with holes in them for the having of sex, which is actually interesting because one of the few things you wouldn't wear while having sex would be your zizzi.
Okay. Oh, and I want to go back. There was a question here. Maybe I think it's a tangent here, but somebody asked in Japanese if there's research in Japan. 日本での研究はありますか? Or if asking if one of us has researched. So I am not quite sure what the question is in terms of research or practice in Japan, training in Japan. Training for what and for which one of us is this question? And training for what? I think that'll be coming up in a moment. Okay, it's for me. Training for what? Anything so I can travel there and write it off. What?
I think they're looking for continuing education in Japan so that the education piece becomes a tax deduction for them.
Okay, so first of all, I'm not a therapist, right? So I am a sexuality educator, and somebody referred to me recently as a sexual philosopher.
I can see that. I like that for you.
Yeah. And I think this is where the tradition of discourse within Judaism fascinates me a lot. Laura Antonio and I talk a lot about this. So discourse and questioning, it appeals to me. Well, training in Japan. Therapy is not big in Japan at all. So in terms of traveling to Japan and writing it off, hit me up maybe in my Patreon. I have office hours regularly, so I can address that question because I think it's for those in the JET program. Okay. Hit me up in the office hours during my Patreon because I think that's a little different topic. But back to you, Stephanie. Back to all the Jewish therapists. But seriously, in terms, you were talking about mitzvah, and which is something I also knew through my Jewish friends educating me along the way. And by the way, yesterday I got to participate in a Purim spiel. That was fun.
I saw the pictures. It looked like Haman. This is where those in the chat should be booing. Okay, go ahead, Midori.
So that was a lot of fun. But in terms of sexuality and pleasure, especially focusing on the wife's pleasure being a blessing and part of one's faith, practice, and family responsibility. I could see how there would be confusion from those not familiar. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't come from a Christian background. There is this concept of sin that I hear, as opposed to just don't be unkind. And the question that I'll hear from my more Christian-leaning friends, or the question or the struggle is kink a sin? And I think that's also mixed in with North American culture. Mm-hmm. And how does kink fit into the blessings and joy and the practice of Judaism, if, say, I were to ask a rabbi?
Well, if you ask a rabbi, you will get many different answers depending on where you go.
Uh-huh.
I actually have at least 4 separate books on my desk that I pulled out that have different perspectives on Jewish sexuality. I'm going to start with the most simplistic understanding of sin in Judaism, which is it's temporary. Every year during the High Holy Days, there is the most holy, the most solemn, the most sacred day of the Jewish calendar is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And you are expected to spend 40 days leading up to Yom Kippur doing a lot of self-reflection and thinking about who you have harmed over the last year and going to them and making it right. And I think that is so important because in other traditions, a sin is something you do against God. Either you've blasphemed, you've done something that's like literally directed at God, or you've just made yourself a little bit dirtier, a little bit grosser, a little bit less worthy, and therefore you're an affront to God. We don't have that concept. Sins are things that we do to each other, and it is on us to make that right with the person that we harmed. The best explanation I ever gave was a rabbi once told me, if I walked up to you and punched you in the face, I could not pray to God for forgiveness because I didn't punch God. God cannot forgive me for that. I have to go to you and ask you for forgiveness because you are the one I punched. If I take God's name in vain, you can't forgive me for that because you're not God. You have your own name. That I have to make right with God. And so right off the bat, there's this really big distinction between this idea of sort of general salvation, where you get born again or you get baptized or you make a faith commitment of some kind and you get a universal fresh start. All your sins are forgiven, starting over with a blank slate. Jews don't have that. What we have is a system of personal accountability and the necessity to, before Yom Kippur every year, really think long and hard about the ways in which we fucked up over the last year and how we can make that right. The only time we are exempt from going to the person that we harmed and making it right directly with them would be if approaching them would actually cause them more grief. So think about a drunk driver who hits somebody and kills somebody in the car with them. Most rabbis would say, no, you're not going to show up at that person's door and ask them to forgive you because all that does is exacerbate their grief and bring that pain back up for them. At a certain point, you just have to own that that's what you've done. Which then often leads to the question, well, if you can't get rid of all the sins, then what do you do? But truly the idea of sin being temporary, it carries over because there isn't really a concept of hell in Judaism. In the most stringent branches, there can be. But even in those branches, there's no concept of a universal hell. It lasts for all time, you're there for eternity. And there's no concept of hell being a place of torture and pain and suffering. It's a place of separation. My favorite rabbi ever just said it's a heavenly timeout. You have to go and you need to sit over there and think about what you've done, and you do not get to have cupcakes with the other children because you messed up. So there are rabbinical teachings that say, the worst amount of time you would ever be in hell is 7 years. And so then after the Holocaust, people are like, okay, well, what about Hitler? Hitler gets more than 7 years. And so they went back into the Talmud and back into sort of the mystical sources. And really the most common answer is either there is no heaven and hell, the life you have is the life you have, and your eternity is the name that you leave behind, which I think is really beautiful. The way that you have an immortal life is how people remember you and what they say about you and the legacy that you leave. That is your eternity. Alternately, some people say, you are mostly good, you go to heaven. If you are mostly bad, you go to hell. Max 7 years. If you are so bad that you're irredeemable, you just blip out of existence and you're just done. But the idea of this very black and white, very yes or no, very pure or sinful dichotomy isn't really present in Judaism. And where you do make mistakes, where you do break relationships, where you do harm yourself or someone else, you always have the opportunity to make that right in some way. And if you can't go to that person, maybe you find another way. Maybe the drunk driver goes and volunteers and does high school seminars for MAD for the next 30 years. It's not going to be what the letter of the law says you should do. But if you want to atone, atonement is always available. And every year we have this very ritualized, very formal process of doing that. The other thing that I love is that atonement process tries very, very hard to minimize shame and to protect the individual from being made to feel bad for what they are trying to make right. So there are set prayers in the Yom Kippur service that are collective admissions of guilt. We have stolen, we have lied, we have cheated. Because what it does is it lets everybody have their moment to go, yeah, I did that. Yeah, that's me. Okay, that's embarrassing. I don't really want to say it, but I know I have to, without anybody being singled out. And I think that when you create a space and a culture that lets people believe that they're capable of making something right and doing it differently next time, that can be incredibly, incredibly powerful. So that is kind of the cultural lens that people are bringing to the question of, is kink sin? And the question is, well, why would it be? Unless it's non-consensual, unless you are harming your partner, unless you are doing something that leaves them feeling hurt or broken or afraid, or then it can't be sinful because it's consensual and it's being done in a place of integrity and authenticity and thoughtfulness and mutual regard. And it doesn't have to be what you want to do, but the fact that you find it off-putting doesn't necessarily mean that God does.
And which leads, as you were just saying, right into where I want to talk about in terms of consent, kink, and Judaism. And coming from a perspective of a sex therapist, do you encounter clients who struggle around consent issues, or because what you were just talking about in terms of tradition of acknowledging and doing better, which is about consent and how to handle it when you have a consent fuck up of some sort, violation or incident or all the things that can happen. So tying this into consent as well as making right. Do you encounter conversations and questions around that, whether with your clients or colleagues?
I think that my colleagues often worry about observant Jewish women. I think that because the expectation of modesty and the expectation of purity is such that externally it can look very closed off or very constrained. We tend to layer our own cultural values on it. When I was married in my previous relationship, I covered my hair full time. That changed when I married my now partner because he's not Jewish and it felt different to me. And I made reform movement. I get to educate myself and decide, throw back to the beginning. I made a different choice about what that meant in this relationship versus what that meant in a past relationship. But when I covered my hair, it was always amazing how many comments I got from people about whether or not that felt constraining, or what didn't I get frustrated that I couldn't have pretty hairstyles, or, did I ever get upset that people told me I had to do that? And those are just the ones that didn't conflate me for Muslim after 9/11. Like, there was a lot of hostility towards hair covering for a while, but I always got questions that assumed it was a mandate imposed upon me, as opposed to something that was a freely made choice. And I think that particularly for more observant women, we see them dressing modestly, we see them sitting in a separate section of their synagogue for prayers, or we see them not shaking their manager's hand at the end of their performance review. And we assume that that must feel oppressive to them in some way. And that's not necessarily or even really often the case. The biggest area where I see that is around what little people know about family purity in Orthodox families. The idea that when a woman is menstruating, they don't touch their partner, they don't sleep in the same bed often. There's a whole bunch of strictures and laws around that. And often when I'm doing consults for people who have Jewish clients, they immediately rush to, oh, well, that's because culturally they believe she's dirty. She's impure, so she has to stay away because she's being punished for, and it comes back to that very binary, either sinful or good, clean or dirty sort of dynamic. And the laws of purity were originally envisioned as a way to preserve and protect intimacy in the relationship. When we look at the source documents, the Talmudic writings, the Gemara, which frankly nobody does, everybody's going off of what they saw in a TikTok video. But when you actually go back to why were these traditions created and how were they explained by the people that helped create this culture, what we find is a deep concern that marriage gets stale and that people get bored, and that one of the best ways to protect a relationship is to carve out a space of separation, because it makes the coming back together so much more exciting. And it's not a time of you're dirty and gross and stay away from me, you filthy woman. It's, oh, you look beautiful. God, I wish I could give you a hug right now. Oh, it's killing me that I can't touch you right now. And by the end of that cycle, when she goes to the mikvah, which is the ritual bath, and comes back, you're actually, the law says you're supposed to have sex the night that your wife returns from the mikvah, because the law has created a pattern of 10 or so days of you desperately wanting to touch each other and not being able to.
Oh God, it's edging.
Yes. So it's really about understanding not just what people do, but why they're doing it. And I have worked with so many Jewish clients that don't necessarily know the whys behind all the things they do. Comes up a lot with masturbation. So many of my clients will say, oh, well, the Bible says masturbation's wrong, so I can't do it. It's the spilling of the seed, not allowed to spill the seed. And whether they are evangelical Christian or whether they are Jews, I will look at them and say, but where does that story? Do you know the story behind that little spilling of the seeds quip? And frankly, nobody ever has. Or if they do, they're like, yeah, there was this one guy and he pulled out and God killed him. And the takeaway and the way that this has been explained within Christian theology is he spilled the seed. He was killed because he wasted semen. And they have turned this into no masturbation. But in the Jewish community at the time that the Bible story was written, we're talking literally 5,000-6,000 years ago. It was primitive, it was tribal, and your tribal identity was the only protection you had. You were in this tribe, they protected you from that tribe. You didn't want to be without a tribe because then nobody would protect you. And the way that women were connected to their tribe, to their family, was through birth of their own. Either I was born into this tribe, or marriage and childbirth. I was married into this tribe. His dad, or that man, is my child's father. I am now a part of this tribe. And the Bible story that spilling of the seed and masturbation comes from is a story of a girl who was widowed. And the Jewish law at the time was if your husband dies and you don't have a child, it's his brother's responsibility to impregnate you, because that protects her status within the tribe. It keeps her a part of the community. And the Bible story is the brother went to do that and he pulled out. He was punished not for wasting semen, but because he had an obligation to protect somebody who was all of a sudden adrift, all of a sudden didn't have a community, didn't have a status, didn't have a place to be safe and protected. He had a responsibility to make sure that she had a home, and he chose not to. That's the sin that people have reinterpreted as, oh, masturbation's bad. So that's what I mean when I talk about cultural competency. And when I talk about having these conversations, is it's not enough to go, well, I've heard this thing and that's how it's been interpreted, so that's what it means. We need to know the origins of things, and we need to be able to have those conversations with our clients, because it's amazing to see their faces when I tell them that the sin was not that he pulled out. The sin was that he left her adrift without a tribe. That is a much different message. And I think that's so much, if we're raising children, if we're raising sex positive children, I want my kids' most important value to be protect the helpless, not don't jack off.
And I'm noticing a very similar parallel to what some clinicians, you were talking about, the assuming that it's, oh, you filthy, icky woman. Very similar to, oh, BDSM is abuse, right? And I want to address more towards consent, since this is Consent Dojo,
Absolutely.
and where consent weaves into these 3 circles that we've been talking about. So consent and being observant and playing, and where can people be observant and really awesome at consent? Where and how can clinicians support around consent, kink, and being observant? I know I'm not being articulate here.
Fine.
Yeah.
I think that one of the biggest sort of consent pieces for Jewish kinksters, and this is true for a lot of other ethnic kinkster groups, is the capacity for fetishization of them. There is, every year if we go to Halloween USA, there's always like the naughty nun and the like dirty priest sort of costumes. And there's become a recent, not even recent, but last 10, 15 years, this idea of playing with Judaism and sacrilege has become a little bit more of a thing. And if that is a Jewish person doing that as a way of processing their own religious experience or trauma, it can be cathartic, it can be empowering, it can be many things. But where somebody that's not a part of that group is doing it, it can become problematic and it can become exploitative. There was a moment when I was single and I was dating, and I was talking to somebody and we were discussing whether or not we were gonna go out on a date, and we were chatting, and I said that I couldn't do coffee on Friday because Friday's Shabbat and I was going to Shabbat. And he goes, "Oh, you're Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Can I call you my little Jewish whore?" And that was my face. And I looked at him and I said, no, because millions of women over thousands of years, that has been the last words they ever heard. And you're not going to say that to me. It was absolutely mind-blowing when it happened. And clearly coffee date never happened at all, ever. But the idea that people think that's okay, the idea that people think that they can take any aspect of somebody's identity and sexualize it without their consent is huge. That happens for people of color, that happens for all sorts of demographic groups. And I think that's probably one of the biggest consent violations that most minority kinksters face. This idea that who I am is being eroticized for you, not with me. And it's okay if somebody wants to eroticize or fetishize or kink up some element of their identity, as long as they're the ones leading that. But I think so often other people assume that if it brings them pleasure, if it turns them on, that it doesn't necessarily need to be negotiated before it's spoken.
Yeah, and attendee here had the exactly right comment to that, and they said, "The hell?"
Yeah, it was not one of the greatest conversations I've ever had.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. The exoticization and the fetishization. What else comes to mind to you around how consent weaves into all of this?
This is purely my own hypothesis. I have no research, no literature, no evidence, so everybody can yell at me later. But I suspect that Jewish kinksters write the best contracts. I suspect that when we're negotiating, because it's already a part of the culture to write down and define the terms of the relationship, right? It's already like, no matter how, I mean, unless you are completely secular, completely non-observant Jew, even the most liberal, secularish, Jewish couples have a wedding ketubah when they get married. A lot of times it's just strict, like traditional language. They don't necessarily put a lot of time and thought into it, but it's the signing of the wedding contract is what actually makes you married in Judaism. Before the ceremony, the signing of the ketubah is what makes you married. So this idea of relationship contracts is such a huge part of our culture in general that I suspect that if I could get the funding to go and study Jewish kinky relationship dynamics, I would find some amazing, amazing relationship contracts.
Yeah, there should be funding for that. You should get funding for that. Absolutely. Absolutely. And outside of this discussion, you and I have actually talked about scene negotiation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your basic framework is mentioned in Sprinkles, and you and my partner recorded an entire role play scenario for me that's going to be an entire chapter in one of my 2 next books. I just haven't decided which one yet. What you gave us was so amazing. I want to be really intentional about how I deploy the Midori awesomeness. So I have 2 books I'm under contract to write, and 1 more I'm shopping right now. And I'm just debating which of the 2 out of 3 that I want you in, because the example you gave of negotiating consent in a way that is playful and fun and feels organic and natural and not like this weird rote mood breaker is amazing. Yeah. So you have been mentioned, I think, in every one of my books so far, whether you knew it or not. And you get a couple paragraphs in Sprinkles, and you're going to get basically an entire chapter in the next book.
That was a fun negotiation.
It really was.
That was fun. And there were moments where I'm like, haha, stumped you, ha.
He still brings up the bozo mask, so thanks for that. And for everybody who has no idea what we're talking about, I'll let Midori know which book I put it in, and then you all can read it there, and you'll know exactly. You'll get the full transcript.
Yep. Now, I am thoroughly enjoying this conversation, and I am hoping that you and I will be at, I don't know if you're coming to ASECT or any of those.
I'm presenting at ASECT this year.
San Francisco.
Yes. I'm giving my talk on caregiver kinks. We're talking about age play and pet play.
Hey, my town. So, little coffee.
Yeah.
Let me show you town and continue this conversation. Then, I am getting to do one of the virtual presentations. They accepted, the fundamentals of feminine dominance, archetypes of desires. I'm going to put the participating therapist through it. 2/3 of the class is that, and then 1/3 is the structural design challenges and the decision on how I use the virtual tools to create that class. So, but that one's going to be virtual. Anyhow, I want to continue this conversation and other fascinating things, but we've got just like 5 minutes left. And what would you like the attendees now, as well as viewers later, to know about or think about consent moving forward?
So the biggest way that consent ties into the work I'm doing right now is my partner and I do a weekly podcast called Securing Sexuality. And in October, there will be a Securing Sexuality live event here in Detroit. It's going to be 2 days. It's approved for ASEC CEUs. We're going for social work and APA as well. But we every week have a conversation about intersections of intimacy and technology. And 9 times out of 10, that somehow ties directly into consent, because we're talking about how your information is handled, who has access to you, how you're tracked, what your doctors can share about you, how your sex toys can be weaponized against you. We just recorded an interview with a friend of ours who runs something called the Internet of Dongs Project. He is a hacker who breaks sex toys and then reports to the companies how he broke them so that they can make them safer. And I don't know if anybody remembers, a couple years ago, there was a case where a whole bunch of Bluetooth-enabled cock cages were held for ransom. They were hacked and people had their bits held for ransom. They had to pay Bitcoin to get out of their cock cages. He actually discovered that vulnerability and reported it to the company before that ever happened. And they didn't think it was a big deal and didn't do anything about it. So we just recorded an interview with him. We have some amazing, amazing, amazing people coming to Detroit to talk about all sorts of consent related things. One of the ones I'm most excited about is we have an expert from Temple University coming in to talk about how the elderly are being targeted by romance scammers online. And we have an attorney from New York who's going to come in and talk about state surveillance of trans bodies right now. So there are so many different ways that our use of technology influences not only our relationships and our sexuality, but also what we're consenting to, whether we know we're consenting to it or not. So if anybody's interested in those conversations, the podcast is weekly and the conference tickets are on sale now. And I will give Midori, I'll set up a coupon code just for like the people that were here. And anybody that's interested in getting a super cheap ticket to the educational event in Detroit, you can get a Midori special discount. But that is the biggest thing that we're working on this year. It is time consuming. And then we have a Securing Sexuality book that's coming out in 2024. I'm working on BDSM and Kinks, the Basics, which is just going to be like a little quick hit book for Routledge. And I'm shopping my next book, which would be almost a sequel to Sprinkles. My working title is Everyday Deviance, and I consider it less of a BDSM and kink how-to and more of a etiquette guide, how to be a good member of the BDSM and kink community. So those are my next projects, but the most immediate and the most exciting would be the Securing Sexuality podcast and conference.
Now, when is the conference? Somebody's asking, but I'm also asking this. It's in person?
It is in person. Mm-hmm. My partner he hates when I say this, but it's just simply factually accurate. He is internationally known in cybersecurity. His job is to he gets paid to travel around the world and be him talking about cybersecurity. And he has been to many of our conferences. And he has been very confused as to why so many sex therapy conferences tend to be rather academic and dull. So we wanted it to be in person because we want all of the rigor and learning of a sexology con and all of the playfulness and fun of a hacker con. So we have social events planned that are built into the dates. We have an optional Detroit field trip. We're working with some really amazing people if anybody wanted to stay an extra day and do a tour of the city with us and see our kink institutions, our local distilleries, all sorts of stuff. So the actual conference, Mr. Greg put in the chat, it's October 19th and 20th. The optional field trip day is the 21st. It is not CEUs, but it is going to be a smaller group and a big blast. Anybody is welcome. We want people that are interested in sexual health. We want people that are interested in privacy. We want people that are interested in technology. Frankly, we want people that use technology and want to make sure that they're doing it safely. We want this to be very accessible. We actually launched the podcast after Dobbs ruling came out. Our very first episode was Privacy in a Post-Roe America, and we started doing the podcast because we wanted people to have the information they needed to be safe once Roe v. Wade was overturned. And we've been doing it every week since. So it very much is consent driven. We just have lots of different lenses that we look at consent through.
I have my phone in my hand, not because I'm checking out, but I'm checking dates for my October.
You know we want you there. You know we want you there.
So far, I only have like a fun thing I might go to, but that's like just a fun thing. So work-wise, because this is fascinating.
And this will also be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, like fucking off kind of thing.
Right? I know.
But yeah, but okay. I want to go.
I love it. Anybody that wants to go, I will set up a special coupon code just for the Midori people. Midori and Mr. Greg, I'll email you that in the next day or two. So right now we just very quietly open ticket sales. So go ahead.
May I put that in my Patreon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
We just very quietly open ticket sales with early bird pricing. So early bird pricing plus the Midori discount code would make sure people get the absolute cheapest it's going to be all year.
Okay. Great. Now, for those of you who are here live, hold on just a moment, and I'm going to close the recording, but then I'll be right back, so y'all hang out just a bit. Okay. So this has been a really fascinating Consent Dojo, and I think I just booked myself a trip to Detroit. Oh my God. Or I'm booking myself. I got to start looking at my flights. Consent Dojo. Consent is important. It is sexy. It's not always easy, and it's a continual building. And we have to work up our consent muscle because, well, we got to stay in shape. We can always do better. So, yeah, keep building that consent muscle. And I look forward to you joining another Consent Dojo next month. And for those of you who are viewing this later, thank you. And see you in another dojo.